Hello, and welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you're up this week. What do you bring to the table today?
Yes, so I have brought a resource to the table for us to talk about today, and I'm very excited about it. It's called Painting the Ocean and the Sky, and it was produced by Shira, Hassan, and our friends over at Interrupting Criminalization. So I did a little digging into Shira. Shira Hassan is an author and a fellow over at Interrupting Criminalization, and she runs their support network called the Help Desk, which helps consult with and provide resources to people and groups working to interrupt crises and violence without using the police, which, when I read that, I was like, well, this makes sense that she wrote this resource, put this resource together. I think she's a great person to learn from, obviously. This resource guide is full of helpful information and ideas for how to build collective community-based responses and interventions to crises without the reliance of the police and the criminal punishment system, which I think is really great and important. There are a handful of sections or essays really in this resource, including one, key definitions that center the work and concepts discussed in it. Two, designing abolitionist projects. So things like social services, mutual aid, peer-to-peer work, and what's important to consider when engaging in that kind of work. And three, the differences between crisis response and emergency response, and understanding that there's a distinction there and the best way to serve people. So, all really good stuff. And there's lots more in it. That's just a brief overarching overview of it. But I thought this was an incredibly powerful, informative, and just helpful resource and guide for all of us, but certainly for organizers engaged in abolition and movement work in particular. So I learned a lot from it. I'm so excited to talk about it today. Yeah, what did you think of it?
I thought it was really great. Like you said, as a resource to demonstrate how groups operate outside of the norms of crisis and emergency response or support to people who need support in a way that is more based in solidarity, operating outside the norms of the nonprofit industrial complex.
Yes.
There's a lot of great political education here about the NPIC, nonprofit industrial complex, and how services become depoliticized when they move into that nonprofit status because they usually have to.
Yeah.
Because of funders and laws and different restrictions that are placed on the legal status of a nonprofit organization.
Right.
So I think making concepts like peer-to-peer organizing, politicized social services, and mutual aid easily available in a resource like this gives people the opportunity to reflect on how they participate in the ways that state control influences the work they do and how they can look to use these models to inspire them to find alternative ways to operate, like that politicized social service idea or mutual aid or what have you, and trying to avoid the ways that the state interrupts the real mission and values behind organizers to push people into creating nonprofits and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the nonprofit industrial complex. That was fascinating to me to sort of read about as a concept. It was fascinating to sort of see and to think about all of the ways in which the state has co-opted nonprofits and more broadly, like it includes things like charities and foundations and these sort of traditional nonprofit organizations, these things that we think of as public goods, but, lumping them in and seeing them as part of this concept, this nonprofit industrial complex. I think that was a real shift in thinking for me and just in general. I think about these organizations and these services and what they should be doing, what they maybe are restricted in doing and all of that, like you mentioned. And one of the things that stood out to me in thinking about how we serve real people in need in meaningful and helpful ways, it was so important. And they're not able to accomplish that
Yep.
in so many ways. And so one of the great resources in this guide was this really incredible infographic that outlines these 6 ways of how the state is at play and uses the nonprofit industrial complex and the organizations that comprise it in really coercive and dangerous ways, I think. And so I wanted to just bring that to the table because I thought it was fascinating. So through the nonprofit industrial complex, this resource says the state, 1, monitors and controls social justice movements. 2, diverts public money into private hands through foundations. 3, manages and controls dissent in order to make the world safer for capitalism. And that's a big one to me. This idea of bringing us back to what's quote unquote acceptable behavior or ways of being. So I appreciated that one. 4, the state can redirect activist energies into career-based modes of organizing instead of mass-based organizing capable of actually transforming society. I thought that one was huge. 5, the state allows corporations to mask their exploitative and colonial work practices through philanthropic work. And last but not least, the state encourages social movements to model themselves after capitalist structures rather than challenge them.
Yeah.
So all that to me, I thought was just so fascinating, but it just so important for folks to know about and to recognize. I thought it was a huge reason why we need abolitionist and feminist activism and organizing and movement work to create and implement abolitionist-centered organizations and services. And in this resource, she quotes Dean Spade a lot, which I think is great. Dean Spade says, we need these organizations to build people power, right? And I think organizations that build a world in which folks have their humanity and their ability to live the life that they deserve. So, yeah, the whole concept of this nonprofit industrial complex and what we truly need, I thought was a huge component of this resource.
Yeah, and that number 5 on the list, the state allows corporations to mask their exploitative and colonial work practices through philanthropic work, reminds me of it's washing, and then it's usually like greenwashing or it's pink washing or it's what have you,
right?
Where people are publicly doing one thing, but really they're not for that thing.
Absolutely.
So, and it looks like there's sports washing where countries will buy popular sports teams or host the Olympics to help manage their reputation on the world stage,
on the global stage,
so that they have a more polished reputation, and we ignore some of the not so nice things that they do.
Absolutely.
And that's happening. This is a version of that on different scales.
Absolutely.
Different places.
In fact, I just saw an Olympics commercial. So thinking about what happens at the Olympics and how they show coverage of these cities, and they do stories on these cities and these places, and they only show the good oftentimes and the pretty places, the pristine places, where they're thriving, but they don't show the other side often. So yeah.
Well, and they don't show the people who were displaced to make those pretty shiny places that exist
happen.
So, washing is a whole thing. But that's a different podcast episode. The section on mutual aid, as you said, was great. Reminded me that I want to reread Dean Spade's book about mutual aid.
Absolutely.
Which is, fittingly, it's called Mutual Aid. So add that to the to-read list at some point.
Absolutely.
But he's quoted here in this section of the toolkit listing 3 elements of mutual aid work. So 1, mutual aid projects work to meet survival needs and build shared understanding about why people do not have what they need. 2, mutual aid projects mobilize people, expand solidarity, and build movements. And 3, mutual aid projects are participatory, solving problems through collective actions rather than waiting for saviors. So this is entirely different than charity.
Right.
This process actually analyzes the systems that create the situation where people find themselves needing something that they can't have or they can't get for whatever reason.
Right.
Mutual aid is about meeting those needs and addressing the underlying systems that creates the conditions where people need something. And I think that that's the big difference. This is founded in solidarity. It's founded in understanding what it is people need around you and why that need exists. What's the gap in the system that creates that need, and then how do we not only meet that need but figure out how to eliminate the gap in the future, eliminate the system that's creating that gap in the future, or what have you. And let's also do political work toward the end of that system.
Yeah.
And so I think mutual aid is a really great thing. I'm glad it was in here and highlighted in this way, because I think it's such an important thing to understand. And I think that the term became really popular during the pandemic, and people have molded it. There's starting to be a co-optation of it, which I think is also something to look out for. So
Absolutely.
I'm glad it was here and defined in this way and outlined in this way of really stating this about solidarity, not about charity.
Yeah, this is such a great definition of what it is, right?
Yeah.
And to me, what stood out about it is it's both, and you kind of alluded to this, it's both analysis and action. That analysis piece is so important. Like, why don't people have what they need? We have to think about that and understand that, and bring people on board to understand, in understanding what it is, and then of course do the work to hopefully to correct it. So I loved and appreciated that Dean Spade's great work was included in this as well. That was a great section. I'm glad you talked about that. One of the other pieces of this resource that I wanted to chat about was, and something that I think is so critical in this work, was the idea of how important it is to center liberatory harm reduction in all of this work. And that's what's at the heart of what's referred to in this resource, as you said at the top of this, politicized social services. So the resource talks about how these organizations, mutual aid projects, services are often led by folks who are targeted by the harms caused by the state, but are still working to help their communities survive and thrive and access the care that they need. So I appreciate that. So in thinking about politicized social services, the resource says this, quote, politicized social services can offer more effective support than charities and actual help to people who are usually locked out of mainstream charity-based carceral social service organizations, because politicized social services are guided by a politic that doesn't presume or prop up the status quo, but instead seeks to change it through its practices. Politicized social services intentionally set themselves up to be low barrier, meaning they don't require identification and impose very few limits on accessing or participating in services. Although politicized social services carry all the same legal responsibilities as any mainstream nonprofit, they often choose to have different practices around mandated reporting, forced hospitalization, and working with law enforcement that may not be written into their policies, but are a part of their practice handbooks and guidelines for workers. So I think that painted a really good picture of what these organizations are doing. One, but as you sort of said at the top as well, these are organizations doing the work, but they're figuring out ways to help people in the ways that they need to be helped. And they're made up of people who understand the issues at play because they've lived through it and or are living through it. So to me, like when I read this, it made it so clear why it's so important that organizations and services like that exist in our world. Yeah. She quotes or she highlights a few great examples of politicized social services. She mentions the Black Panthers and the Black Panther Party and all that they did in their time. The Street Work Project in New York City was fascinating to learn about. And then there was the Broadway Youth Center in Chicago. And I thought it was great that she included it because anyone interested in this work could have a reference point of how this work is being done and can be successful for communities out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that goes hand in hand with that, or was an evolution, it's a different piece of it. You mentioned at the top is peer-to-peer work.
Yes.
And I really appreciated the distinction of that and how it's distinct from mutual aid or politicized social service. They're foundationally very similar.
Yes.
But, quote, in peer-to-peer work, we are the experts in our own lives, and the work is led by us and for us at all times. Peer-to-peer work is not about fixing each other or even helping each other make change. Rather, it is a support network made up of people who choose to accompany each other and have each other's backs for the ride. The working definition I am using in this piece is that a peer-to-peer project is made up of a group of people with multiple overlapping identities and life experiences, whose lived experience makes them uniquely qualified to respond and tend to their own communities. it doesn't necessarily mean that there are no power differences in the group, rather that those differences are engaged directly and consciously, and doing so makes the group more powerful and resourceful.
Yeah.
And there's also some analysis in this section about how peer-to-peer work has been co-opted by nonprofits and, again, gets depoliticized in this different context to make it mean something else entirely. And I think it's important to hold on to this, and she's stated this throughout, how important it is to keep a hold on what really peer-to-peer work is and what it has been.
Right.
Because it's such an important model for people to be able to survive who are frequently stigmatized by these lived experiences that they have and the overlapping identities that she says. So yeah, I just really appreciated that distinction and the way that she laid out what peer-to-peer work is.
Absolutely. And one of the things you just said made me feel like this is a good transition to start thinking about application and talking about application, I should say. But we've used the word co-opted a lot.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. She did, through this resource, make it clear that there are instances where this work has been co-opted. And when you sit and think about the analysis and the usefulness of, what she's talked about here and what exists out there, it's easy to see how these things can be co-opted. So one of the things that I think is so valuable about this resource is that she's reminding us of what's at the core of these politicized social services or this peer-to-peer work.
Yep.
and how they've been successful, and reminding us to be careful and thorough in our ongoing analysis about our work, right? Evaluating the work that you're doing to make sure that it is staying pure to your mission in the work.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to name that because you said co-opted, and we've said that a lot, and she named it. So I wanted to bring that up.
Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, let's shift to application. Let's talk about how this resource and certainly our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives. I think one of the things that's so incredible about a resource like this is just how beneficial it is for all of our learning. And I truly mean all of us, and I say this because I think this resource is really accessible. So both in terms of its language and how it offers key definitions and examples of those definitions and everything that it describes, but also in terms of its usefulness to all of us and our learning about the state and state services and as they currently exist, and also what it means and could mean to have services that are actually committed to the health and well-being and safety of our communities and of our people. So to me, I think this is just yet another example of the thing being the application, which I just love when that happens. And I think anyone could pick this up. Certainly any organizers and folks engaged in this work could pick this up and use it and engage with it. And I think early in the resource, it talks about how thousands of people are engaged in this good work. And that to me was just a bright spot to think about, like how people are doing this in their communities. And so this resource is just another way to be successful in that work. And so
Yeah.
I'm so glad that we get to talk about things like this and amplify them because it's so helpful to all of us in our learning, but especially to the folks on the ground serving our communities and doing the work.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. The application for me in this is the education that is in here about the nonprofit industrial complex.
Yes.
And the inherent power dynamics that influence the work that can be done by nonprofits, especially ones who don't continue to be politically active because they're not they're de-incentivized to be politically active. They're not paid to do that work.
Right.
And not paid to organize in their communities anymore. And then that kind of depoliticized work creates a charity dynamic rather than a solidarity one. And I think the application here is how can we do things with people instead of for them?
Yes.
Because that's really where it is. You can't do stuff for people and actually get at the root of what's happening with them.
Yes. Get it right.
It has to be,
Yeah.
in step with them rather than making a decision about what it is that they need and how you're going to provide, and all of that needs to be, all of those questions need to be answered by the people who are being served by whatever that service is.
That's great. Yeah, that's a huge takeaway from this and I picked up on that loud and clear. So great stuff. All right, well, let's talk about homework now. What do we want to do when we leave this table to continue our learning? One of the books referenced in this resource that seems to be all about this concept of nonprofit industrial complex that we talked about is called "The Revolution Will Not Be Funded: Beyond the Nonprofit Industrial Complex." And it was put together by the organization Incite, Women of Color Against Violence. And it's a book I know we've referenced before. It's an older book. It's from 2007, but I'm confident that there's more learning that can be done from reading it. So
Absolutely.
I'd love to add that one to our list in addition to rereading Dean Spade's book. I also want to spend some time with a few of the resources shared in this piece from the Broadway Youth Center in Chicago that I talked about, this organization that was used as an example of a politicized social services. Just, I want to learn more about them. There's also a link to their, it's called Whose Security Is It Anyway toolkit that I would love to check out as a sort of an additional resource to learn about how they're doing this work and what's important to them in the work that they're doing. I'm sure it's going to be a fascinating read. So, yeah. What about you?
Well, agreeing on that homework, that's what I wrote down in my separate notes. And then,
Here we are.
Yep, here we are. So I want to read that book and that toolkit as well. I've already downloaded the toolkit.
Nice.
There's also a workshop recording that corresponds with the release of the toolkit.
Oh.
Called Building Your Abolitionist Toolbox, which looks like a great opportunity to continue learning as well. So those are my pieces, as well as Dean Spade's Mutual Aid. So yeah, that's my homework for this week.
That's a lot of great homework from this. I love it. All right, my friend. Well, you're up next time.
Yeah.
What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm bringing a book called The Palestine Laboratory, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World by Anthony Lowenstein. The book was published by Verso Books in May of 2023, and I heard about it from the Movement Memos podcast, which is hosted by Kelly Hayes and published by Truth Out. And here's a blurb from the Verso webpage about the book. Israel's military-industrial complex uses the occupied Palestinian territories as a testing ground for weaponry and surveillance technology that they then export around the world to despots and democracies. For more than 50 years, occupation of the West Bank and Gaza has given the Israeli state invaluable experience in controlling an enemy population, the Palestinians. It's here that they have perfected the architecture of control. So the book gets into all of that, the way that the technology has evolved due to the occupation of the Palestinian territories, and the way that they export those technologies around the world through private companies that are very, very close to the actual Israeli government and all kinds of things. There's a lot of sprawling tentacles of how this technology touches other pieces of the world that we live in. There's a whole chapter about social media, and they talk about Facebook and Meta and some of the decisions that they've made. They talk about drones, which is a consistent thing. They talk about border control in the EU and how much drone technology from Israel is influencing the choices that the European Union is making in patrolling and monitoring their borders for migrants, and the way that deploying drones in the sea where migrants are allows them to not respond in time and to allow people to die in the sea. There's just a ton in here. I'm not really sure in this moment what it is that I want to talk about from it, because it's just jam-packed full of history and current day dynamics and all kinds of stuff that are really relevant to our conversations that we have here on the podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm my first reaction is that I just wanted to share that I'm so glad that we are continuing to read a book a month. So this is going to be our January 2024 book. So I'm excited about that. And when we were talking about our list, this book made sense for us to bring in January. I think, given what's going on in Israel and Palestine, right, we wanted to talk about this early on, but this book has been really powerful and really educational, and there's a lot of history that I don't know. All right, as I continue to read page by page, I'm like, oh, I didn't know that happened. I didn't know about this. Yeah. So yeah, I'm with you in the idea of I have no idea what we're going to talk about and how I'm going to talk about it, but I'm excited to finish the book and certainly to chat about it with you next time.
Yeah, and the book was released before the current siege that's happening, and so there's a lot of history before then that I think sets the context for what's happening now.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, looking forward to it. It'll be a good way to start our books of 2024. All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what we want you to do, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out on YouTube and sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.